Hi, welcome back. So this is the second lecture. Um, I know I said last time I wasn't going to say anything more about history, but I decided I'd say something about the first two imperial dynasties and quickly overview the following dynasties before the Tang, because the Tang is what we'll really return to with the poetry. And these earlier imperial dynasties, even though they post-date Kongzi, Confucius, they are important in the development of Rushui, Confucianism. Okay, so first of all, the first imperial dynasty I mentioned last time is the Qin, from which we get the name China. It lasted only 15 years, which is short anyway, but is incredibly short for a Chinese dynasty, as you'll see from several of the other dynasties that were very long-lasting. But it established the Chinese Empire under the hierarchical structure that was, I mean, it certainly developed. It changed over the course of the next millennium, or 2 millennia, really, before it ended in the before the imperial China ended with the Republic in the early 20th century. So it definitely changed, but the Qin dynasty established sort of the basic principles that continued, that marked out a kind of continuity across imperial history. So it ended the establishment of the Qin. Ended the Warring States period, brought the various kingdoms together into the strongly centralized empire with the emperor Qin Shi Huangde, a very famous emperor, understandably, given the circumstances. Again, though only established for 15 years, it was very influential. It did many important things, some not so good. First of all, it established legalism as the sort of governing philosophy of the empire. We haven't talked about legalism. We will be talking about it soon. It's a philosophy that is very strict, law-based, as you can infer from the name, that emphasized punishment, but also equality of punishment. Again, it was a very strict, a very harsh system. It is generally seen as opposed to the governing ideals of Rushui, Confucianism, although it actually developed out of a branch of Rushui, as we'll see. It was only the official ruling philosophy of the Qin, and it was supposedly rejected after that, but again, as we'll see, it continued to have very significant influence. We won't be talking about it extensively until we get to the Yuan drama, because it turns up in one of the plays that we'll be discussing. But the fact that many centuries later in the Yuan dynasty, it turns up, even if implicitly, shows it's, even though it was officially rejected, it had a great ongoing influence. So one of the things that the Qin Huangdi, the first emperor of the Qin, did was, or a number of things he did, served to to unify the different Chinese kingdoms by standardizing various aspects of the culture that enabled interaction across these kingdoms. So he standardized measurements so that they all followed the same measurement systems for goods, for distances, and so on. He standardized currency, which was obviously enormously important because it enabled commerce across formerly different kingdoms. He standardized road construction and road size. This may seem trivial, but it was very important for such things as transporting goods. By standardizing road size, he standardized vehicle size. Prior to this time when roads could vary a great deal, vehicles from one region may not be able to pass, from one kingdom may not be able to use the roads from another kingdom. And he standardized the writing system. This is why it's stemming from this development that the relative uniformity of the writing system still exists throughout China, even though you have basically different, related but different languages, mutually incomprehensible spoken languages that share a writing system and are to some degree significantly allow significant interaction through the writing system that would not be possible through speech alone, and of course would also not be possible if the writing system were not uniform. He was, in his preference for legalism, he was unsympathetic to many other schools. He is notorious for burning books and killing scholars. It was an attempt to eliminate alternative schools of thought. All of this ended up serving the subsequent development of Rushui, I think, because the standardization enabled dissemination of thought and teaching across a larger, a vast area that would not have been possible before the imperial unification. And the harshness of the regime did give rise to a sort of backlash in the following dynasty that is part of the reason, I suspect, part of the reason that Rushui, Confucianism, became a sort of officially supported doctrine. Okay, so let's turn to what happened after Qin Shi Huangdi, the establishment of the Han Dynasty. This is another, in the history of China, you have several dynasties that are sort of held up as ideal periods, golden ages, if you will. We've seen one, the Zhou, which is foundational is ideal for Rushui, for Kongzi. Um, Another cultural highlight, a period that people for all of the coming centuries referred back to as a cultural apex in Chinese history, is the Han Dynasty, which lasted for about 400 years, which is quite remarkable. It was founded by a peasant who rebelled against the harshness of the Qin. He took the name Gao Tzu, and you'll often see him referred to. He's an exemplar for the ordinary person who rebels against an authoritarian and oppressive regime and overturns it. He proclaimed, well, I say he overturned it, but of course he was one figure in a widespread rebellion that for which he served as a leader. He obviously did not do it single-handedly. He said he proclaimed that he was ending legalist practices, since they were part of the reason that people rebelled. But much of the harshness of legalism continued. He also said that he was instituting a very simplified legal system. This is all somewhat misleading given what actually happened, although though it was undoubtedly less rigorous, less rigid, less almost brutal, you could say, of the Qin, less than the Qin. It was modulated. The legalism, modulated principally by Confucian Rushui thought. As Roberts discussed, the historian of China, there were two tendencies, or one could isolate two tendencies in early Han governance, referred to as modernist and reformist. The so-called modernist group still advocated basically legalist doctrines, as well as state expansionism, the conquest of neighboring areas, the establishment of rule over a larger region. The so-called reformist tendency was much more in keeping with Rushui, with Confucianism. It stressed protection of the poorest in society, and it valued individual freedom. As DeBerry and Bloom point out, really what occurred historically was a synthesis of not just Rushui and legalism, but of a range of influences, Taoist as well, Moist, as we'll explain later, and others in different proportions depending on the exact ruler. Around 100 years into the dynasty, one of the more famous emperors, Wu Di, established the examination system, which did not at that point entirely govern. Well, the examination system eventually came to virtually entirely determine who entered the state bureaucracy. It didn't have such a determinative function at this time. Many of the positions in the bureaucracy were still given out through contacts or whatever. But the establishment of the exam system was really noteworthy for the historical period in which it took place. And I don't just mean the historical period in China, I mean the historical period anywhere in the world. Because it allowed, in principle, allowed social mobility for at least some people from the society. Anyone, it was a system based on classics, and we'll talk about the classics in a moment. It was basically a Rushui or Confucian orientation, what we would call a liberal arts education, not a technical, pragmatic education. So this liberal arts Rushui exam, anybody who could pass that exam, whatever their class or personal background. Well, actually, there were some restrictions on that, but we don't need to go into those now. It was largely open. People who could pass the exam, even though they were from a lower, putatively lower economic class, or were not did not have familial connections to the ruling elite, could still enter the government and have an influential position. That social mobility was very striking and very important. It's noteworthy that the Han Dynasty was very international in its relations. For example, it undertook trade with Rome, with the Roman Empire at this time. So it's already entering into a sort of global interaction. Later in the dynasty, there was growing inequality, as happened periodically in Chinese history. This worried some scholars, in keeping with the reformist strain that we've already mentioned that had begun early in the Han Dynasty. It worried the scholars that this was not protecting the poorest, and it was also leading potentially to instability in the government, and indeed it did lead to instability in the government. It led to rebellions of poor peasants, and again, in keeping with what I mentioned in the last lecture, these rebellions often had a millenarian context, a millenarian ideology. Were associated with Taoism and saw themselves as engaging not merely in political activity, but in a sort of spiritually guided activity. For example, just quoting from Roberts, in 184, the Yellow Turban and Five Peaks of Grain rebellions broke out. These movements were the work of impoverished peasants, inspired by the prophecies of Taoist priests who predicted the coming of the Great Peace, capital G, capital P. The Yellow Turban movement was centered in the Lower Yangtze, that of the Five Pecks of grain. Began in Sichuan. Both rebellions spread extremely rapidly. The rebels attacked officials whom they blamed for their misery. Both rebellions were repressed with a tremendous loss of life, but other popular movements arose in their place. So the end of the Han was tumultuous, the loss of the mandate of heaven occurred due to what reformists would say was the loss of the mandate of heaven occurred due to the empire, the imperial government ignoring the poor peasantry, the sufferings of ordinary people. I'm not going to say anything about substantive about the subsequent dynasties as they developed up until the Tang dynasty. I'm simply going to mention very often the period between the Han and the Sui is referred to as the Six Dynasties period. The fact that they would it would be referred to as six dynasties and they would all be lumped together sort of suggests to you that they don't have the sort of cultural significance of, say, the Han or the Qin or the Zhou or the Tang or the Sung that we're going to be discussing later. So you don't need to, for purposes of our class, you don't need to know anything about those. The only thing I would mention is that the immediate heirs of the dissolution of the Han were the three kingdoms of the Three Kingdoms period, a 60-year period in the 3rd century of the Common Era. And the Three Kingdoms period is important only because the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a multi-volume historical novel, is one of the most important prose works in Chinese literature, and it concerns this period. And it's made into movies and TV serials and drawn on for dramas, and it's very important for the sort of cultural imagination of Chinese society by the Chinese themselves. And so it's just worth knowing that existed, that period occurred, and that Romance of the Three Kingdoms exists and concerns that period. It's also worth noting that it has one of the most famous opening lines in Chinese literature, an opening line that really encapsulates the one aspect of a recurring philosophy of history that's worth knowing about, and that is, the opening line is, "The empire long divided must unite, long united must divide, thus has it ever been." And so it was long united in the Han, and it was inevitable that it was eventually going to divide. But divided, it was inevitable that it was going to unite again. That cyclical pattern is a recurring schema in Chinese historical thought. The last thing I'll mention about this is before the Tang, the Sui dynasty, again a short-lived dynasty, only 29 years, did have one famous ruler, Wendi, who further developed the exam system. And this is important because it became more important for allowing social mobility and entrance into the ruling bureaucracy. And it, in a sense, further democratized. It isn't exactly what we would call democracy, of course, but it's not simply hereditary rule. It added a further meritocratic element to governance in China. Also, there was further development of what's called the well-field system of land redistribution. So the Sui is another period when there were attempts at economic reform. Okay, we'll go back. The well-field system, I guess I should mention, is a system for redistributing land to the peasantry that was partially cooperative, so that the idea of the system was that a plot of land would be divided into 9 lots for 8 families. 8 of the lots would be apportioned to individual families, and the 9th lot would be farmed collectively, and would be that 9th lot would serve to pay the taxes, so that it was called the well-field system simply because the character for a well looked sort of like our hashtag, and thus looked like a division of land into 9 segments. That's the only reason for that. And it was a sort of traditional concept, the concept that land reform advocates tended to invoke historically, including those land reform advocates from Rushui, from the Confucian tradition. Okay, so we'll turn to the Tang later and the song, and then of course the UN and the UN with the UN drama. We'll eventually get to some post-imperial history up to the People's Republic, but I'm going to leave all that aside for now. I'm going to try to go fairly quickly through a few general cultural principles just as background, because we need to get to Rushui. So in terms of what Europeans would think of as religion, much of the thought that the philosophy, the ethical and life philosophy that's been prominent in China does not really fit the Western idea of religion. Some of it does. Popular Taoism does. Popular Buddhism does. But much of it is really more, again, a philosophy of life rather than what Europeans would think of as religion. This isn't to say that there is not a religious tradition in China. There is. Prior to the spring and autumn period, for example, there was a great emphasis on ancestor devotion, and a prominent deity who came to be referred to subsequently as Tian or heaven, but earlier when referred to as Di, this prominent deity was more personalized or personified in the way that European religion, that we tend to think of religion in a European context. Tian is much more anonymous, much more a matter of a kind of structure of the universe, a kind of overarching norm for the universe, and not so much a matter of a personified deity. But still, in background, there's the sort of personified deity there historically, even though that idea doesn't figure prominently in the discussion of Tian, which again is much more sort of anonymous or a matter of an overarching normative principle. Similarly, the ancestor devotion, it continues, indeed, it continues very prominently in subsequent philosophical tradition. It's central to Confucian, to Ru Shui, though in the early attention to ancestor devotion, this seemed to be largely petitionary. It seemed to be largely a matter of seeking the aid of the ancestors. In Ru Shui, following Kongzi, it doesn't seem to have that function so much anymore. It seems to be the devotion to ancestors, the following through of ceremonies with respect to ancestors and so on, seem to have more of a function of training the people who are performing the ceremonies than of appeasing or petitioning the help of the ancestors themselves. In other words, it seems to be moral training rather than a pragmatic invocation to the aid of spiritual beings. Another recurring aspect of something that we might call religion is the shared idea of Tao, of the way, the path. It has somewhat different meanings in Ru Shui and Taoism and other schools of thought, but it is they all share the idea that there is a proper path, the Tian Dao, the path of heaven, and if you're not on that path, you're meandering, you're lost. You're not going to achieve goals. You're not going to do what is right, what is normative. Though, again, they specify what the path entails somewhat differently. In metaphysics, sort of the larger, the way that they conceive of the larger structure of the universe, there are sort of two binary oppositions that are worth noting. One I'm sure you've heard of, yin-yang. Yin is a whole series of properties, passive, female. It's associated with the moon. Yang is a whole series of opposed properties, active, male, associated with the sun, and so on. These two are not, I introduced them as one of two sets of binary oppositions, but one of the key things about Chinese metaphysics is that the binary opposites are continually interacting and transforming into one another. So you've seen the little circle with the black and white sort of droplets moving into one another, one black and one white droplet sort of circling one another. The yin-yang image, that shows, that represents the ways in which yin and yang are always interacting. They're always transforming into one another. They're always involved in everything in our lives and in the world. It's part of that cyclicity, that cyclical character that we noted in the romance of the opening line of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the unity and division. That's continuous transformation. And thus, even though they start out as a binary opposition, the two together are necessary to make the whole. And indeed, no real entity is entirely one or the other. Even though yin is female and yang is male, everyone is both yin and yang necessarily. Another binary opposition, less prominent, but that turns up sometimes well, not sometimes, turns up a lot, is qi, usually translated as energy, but it's also matter. Slingerhand translates it as material force, which tries to combine both matter and energy. It's stuff, the material world. This is opposed to li, or principle. So principle is the abstract structure. Qi is the stuff that the abstract principle applies to. This is a sort of more abstract philosophical division than yin and yang, which is more imagistically based, but is also important in various thoughts about historical and cultural and personal development. And I won't be talking about this very much. This opposition very much, but it's important for you to know it exists, because if you do other reading, it definitely will come up. Two other points I want to mention briefly. One is that we're going to be talking particularly about ethical and social concerns. Part of the ethical and social concerns in China stress what we might refer to as decorum. Rather, we might be less inclined to think of some of the things they emphasize as ethics. And specifically, there's a great deal of attention to politeness, inoffensiveness, just sort of proper behavior, speaking properly, looking, sort of whether where you're supposed to stand relative to somebody else, whether you're supposed to bow, how you're supposed to bow, who's supposed to speak first. Again, all sorts of things that we would call decorum. And this has a couple of consequences that are significant for literary study. One is that it's decorous, it's proper, generally not to criticize confrontationally. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that Chinese people don't criticize confrontationally. They do, like everybody everywhere does. But part of the norm of proper comportment is that you should avoid confrontational criticism, but you shouldn't necessarily avoid criticism, even of superiors. And we'll talk about that in Rushui in a little bit. So if you're not supposed to do it, if you are supposed to admonish superiors when they're doing something wrong, but you're not supposed to do it confrontationally, how do you do it? Well, you do it by indirection. You do it by not naming the fault directly, but suggesting the fault. So one way of doing this that is very important historically is what's called criticizing the present by pointing to the past. So invoking if you're addressing the emperor, you don't tell the emperor, well, that's a really stupid policy. You don't even say anything about the policy that the emperor is advocating or has decided to put into effect. But you might tell a story of a previous emperor who did something similar with unfortunate effects. If you manage to do this, you are fulfilling your obligation to admonish the emperor when he is moving in a direction that doesn't seem proper. But you have avoided direct confrontation. Another way of doing this that's extremely important historically and is very striking in the development of Chinese literature is through poetic allusion, so that it was a common practice both within a kingdom and across different kingdoms in the pre-imperial period, or in one of the, in say the Three Kingdoms period. It was a common practice both within and across kingdoms to assume that that people who were educated would know what subsequently came to be called the classic of poetry, and that you could cite a line or a couplet from the classic of poetry and make a political point because of what that line or that couplet would imply. This doesn't mean that the poetry, that the original poem had to mean anything like you're making it mean from the citation. It simply means all that's required is that the phrase you cite be reinterpretable as relevant to the current situation. This is particularly important for us. So this is, again, a decorous way of addressing disagreement in a non-confrontational way. This is important for us because this very loose, interpretively loose use of the classic of poetry carried over to the tradition of Rushui interpretation of the classic of poetry, so that a very free interpretive style developed. And as when we look at the some of the poems from the classic of poetry, you'll see that they may have one pretty obvious, straightforward meaning. For example, many of them are love poems, and they're obviously love poems. They were clearly written as love poems and initially understood as love poems. But they might be understood very differently in a Rushui tradition, in a Confucian tradition. So a poem that is obviously about a lover longing to be reunited with his beloved might be interpreted, in fact, often is interpreted in Rushui tradition as a subordinate longing for his patron, his economic and social superior who supported his poetry. So it's interpreted in relation to social hierarchy rather than in relation to romance, and that practice in effect comes out of this early use of poetry for non-confrontational communication, indirect communication. And the last thing I want to mention on the general points is just something that we won't be able to get to in the course of the semester, but I want you to know it's there, is that there was a great deal of more, as I've emphasized already, a great deal of moral and political diversity in Chinese tradition, and perhaps of particular interest to Americans today, given changes in social understanding of sex, gender, and sexuality in the last half century. It's worth noting that some of the most prominent works of Chinese literature are what we would consider very progressive on issues of, for example, same-sex desire or what we would consider transgendering. And we find this in, for example, the what's often considered the greatest novel in Chinese, A Story of the Stone or Dream of Red Mansions. It goes by both those titles. Story of the Stone is actually probably a more accurate rendition, and not probably is a more accurate rendition of the title, which deals with same-sex desire extensively and non-judgmentally. Butterfly Lovers includes what one might think of as a cross-dressing character, but one might also think of as a transgendered character, as one of the two lovers. So that's just to give you an idea of some of that diversity. Okay. Now, Ru Shui. We'll only begin this today, and then I'll continue it on the next lecture. Ru is sometimes Ru Jia. Again, Jia is school or family. Shui is, again, school, form of study, knowledge. So you could refer to these as the tradition of Ru or the school of Ru. Ru is sometimes translated as scholar. The characters are human plus need or ought. DeBerry and Bloom say that Ru was often used to mean gentle or soft, and was particularly opposed to the confrontational heroism of warfare. I haven't seen, this is not the way people generally discuss it, but DeBerry and Bloom are prominent sinologists, Chinese scholars of Chinese history and culture, and they emphasize this, and it does make sense given the context in which Ru Shui arose, in the very divisive, embattled spring and autumn periods, and then was developed in the Warring States period. So in both cases, it very much arose in opposition to violence and warfare. Again, Kongzi, about 500, who was alive about 2,500 years ago, his the work that's most important that represents Kongzi's thought, Confucius's thought, is the Analects, the Lun Yu, translates as Selected Conversations, and we'll be looking at some passages from that. It's one of, there are different lists of Chinese classics, and different people make up different lists. Sometimes you'll find that there are 5 classics. A more encompassing list has 13 classics. Classic is usually used to translate the word Jing. So the Jing, the classics include the Yi Jing, or I Ching, or I Ching. The CH in the earlier transcription system was pronounced J. Again, I'm using the pinyin system where J is used for J. So you may have heard of the Book of Changes. It's basically initially a book used for forecasting the future, which was an important part of very early Chinese pre-Kongzi, pre-Ru Shui Chinese tradition. it became seen as a book of wisdom later on. Other Jing, other classics include the Shi Jing, sometimes translated as the Book of Odes, the classic of poetry. We'll be reading things from that. There's the Book of Ceremonies or Rites, the classic of history, the Lun Yu, that I've already mentioned, the Analects, Meng Tse, the Shao Jing, the classic of filial piety. Filial piety is Shao, Xiao. The classic of rituals includes two subsections, the Da Shui and the Zhengyong. Da Shui means the greater learning is the way it's usually translated. You already know the word Shui, school or learning or knowledge. And Da just means big, the big learning, the big knowledge. Is one section of the classic of rituals or the classic of ceremonies. Another, the doctrine of the mean, the Zhong, which is the middle. Zhong is, as I say, the middle, and Yong is translated as doctrine. So there are these classics, and some of which we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at the Lun Yu, the Meng Tse, and these the Da Shui and the Zhengyong. I should also note that there's a huge commentatorial tradition. All of these classics have given rise to extensive commentaries by scholars over the millennia. And so there's, if you really want to study Ru Shui, there's just, you can't stop with the classics themselves. You have many, 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 many books, basically libraries full of books of commentatorial tradition. Unsurprisingly, a central virtue of Ru Shui is what's called Hao Shui. Hao is good. It means good. If you've heard like the greeting Ni Hao, basically it means you good. So Hao Shui is usually translated as dedication to learning, and as you can see why that would be a central virtue in such a tradition. Briefly, just want to alert you to the commonplace in Ru Shui that there are 5 basic human relations. The ruler-minister relation, the father-son relation, the husband-wife relation, the elder-younger relation, and the friend-friend relation. Now, I'm not going to be doing anything with these specific relations, so I might allude to one or another, or might refer to one or another briefly on occasion. I won't be emphasizing them. But I bring it up simply to note that a common practice in Ru Shui is thinking about a range of often very great, very large social problems in terms of very personal, relatable human interactions. And isolating 5 human relationships is in part one way of doing that. It allows us to focus on things that are more familiar. Father, son, husband, wife, elder, younger, and friend are familiar to all of us. Ruler, minister would not be familiar to all of us, but it would be familiar to people in the bureaucracy. So for one large segment of the audience, the readership for the Ru Shui writings, that would be a familiar relationship too. Okay, good. A basic principle, just to get an overall idea of how uh, relationships work, is that even though they're different, they're differentiated by the exact nature of the relationship. The father-son relationship is not the same as husband-wife, elder-younger, and certainly not a friend-friend. Um, there are particulars in each case, but as a general rule, these are hierarchical relationships except for friend-friend. And basically, the Rushui idea is that one's relation to those higher in the hierarchy should be reverential or respectful, and one's relation to those lower in the hierarchy should be exemplary. So to my superiors in this system, to my superiors, I should be respectful. To my inferiors, I should show the proper example. So it's important in showing the proper example that I not be disdainful, that I not be looking down on those who are socially inferior to me. Rather, I should be concerned with embodying the norms and imperatives that they should follow. So to take a simple example, my concern, if I have a son, my concern with my son should be to encourage, if I'm concerned to encourage filial piety in my son, thus devotion, reverence, respect to me, following proper ceremonial or following proper decorum, speaking properly, standing properly, deferring properly, speaking without aggression, and so on, to me, then how do I do that? How do I encourage that on the part of my son, if I have a son? I in fact don't, but if I did. How would I encourage that? Well, one way of encouraging that would be to shout at him if he misbehaves. But that is not what the system putatively urges. Rather, it says that in order to instruct my son in Shao, filial piety, I should be exemplary in my own filial piety with respect to my own father. So that's just a simple example of this sort of process. So, but again, as I mentioned, this reverence up and example down is not confined, does not mean that admonishment, that criticism is off the table, is forbidden. Quite the contrary, admonishment is important, not only from the superior to the inferior. It's not only important that rulers admonish ministers, fathers, sons, and so on. Unfortunately, husband-wife is considered a hierarchical relation in this context. I know that none of us would agree with that, but that's the way it was thought of in the West too. So I don't think we can be too critical of China 2 millennia ago for things that basically everybody was doing. But anyway, back to the point, the admonishment doesn't just go from ruler to minister and so on. It also goes from minister to ruler, son to father, and so forth, wife to husband, younger to elder brother. And that's why, as I noted just a few minutes ago, why admonishment through indirection became so important, through quoting poetry or criticizing the present by pointing to the past and so forth. Okay, now I want to look at a couple of passages from the Lunyu to illustrate these points. Okay, so let me go to the browser here, and I go to ctext.org. That calls up the Chinese Text Project, and I scroll over here to Confucianism, and Confucianism gives this set of texts. The Analects is what I want to look at, but I want to draw your attention to the Mengzi is here too, and the Liji, which is the classic of rites. You have to know the Chinese name. They don't have it under the English name here, so just so you remember that for when we're looking up things in the Liji. And then you'll want to find, well, actually I won't talk about that now. You'll want to find the Zhongyong here, or the Dashui. Dashui is earlier, I think. I'm not seeing Dashui. Wait a minute. There it is. There's the Dashui. So we'll be looking at those later. I'll refer to that again when we get to it. Anyway, so close that up. Go back to the Analects, and I've forgotten what. So we want 13.18. So that's chapter 13. Zilu is the name of the chapter. And we want to go to section 18. The Duke of Shi informed Confucius, saying, "Among us there are those who may be styled upright in their conduct. If their father has stolen a sheep, they will bear witness to the fact." Confucius said, "Among us, in our part of the country, those who are upright are different from this. The father conceals the misconduct of the son, and the son conceals the misconduct of the father. Uprightness is to be found in this." This is I wanted to draw your attention to this passage because it's a very famous passage that shows the central importance of familial relations in Rushui. If you think of, even though I haven't talked extensively about legalism, if you think about the few things that I've said about legalism, you can already guess that a legalist would be like the Duke of Shi. The legalist would say that if your father steals a sheep, it's important to report him. It's important to follow the law. The law is the social, the legal apparatus of the state is the most important thing. But for Kongzi, the most important thing is the family relations. It's the relation of father and son, the relation where the father protects the son and the son defers to and respects the father. And thus they, in a Rushui context, according to Kongzi, this familial relation supersedes any legal obligation. This passage is actually responded to by legalist theorists in their criticism of Rushui doctrine, as we'll see later on. And I should also mention that this sort of brief discussion, this brief conversation reported in this section is characteristic of many of the Analects, where Kongzi encounters either an idea that he thinks is right or an idea that he thinks is misguided, and either praises his interlocutor for the good idea or criticizes the idea as misguided. The other thing I want to say about doesn't really bear on anything we're doing in this passage, but that you should know about is that one value of this this website is that once you've called it up on your computer, you can highlight part of it and right-click and then look up a given term. And so, actually, that wasn't the best word to look up, actually, there isn't any word in here that's really significant. But, here, for example, Ren, that's Ren, meaning person. There's some, or this one, Zhong. Zhong meaning loyalty. Loyalty is an important concept that we'll talk about later. Zhong, a central concept in Ru Shui. And so if you want to see if the concept being referred to in the translation is one of the central concepts we've discussed, you can check by simply highlighting something that seems like it would be in the right vicinity to see if you can find what the Chinese is. So this is an advantage, and this is why I said in an earlier lecture I'd be having you look some at the Chinese and not to be intimidated by that, because it's actually really easy to do. Okay, so there was another passage I wanted to look at. What was that? 14.22. This is on admonishment. So I'm on 13 now. So we have to go back to the Analects. And 14, did I say 22? I know you can't tell me. Oh, Tzilu asked how a ruler should be served. The master said, do not impose on him, and moreover, withstand him to his face. That's a kind of opaque translation. Let me, sorry, I paused that there. So Tzilu asked how a ruler should be served. The master said, do not impose on him, and moreover, withstand him to his face. The DeBerry and Bloom volume translates this slightly differently. Which is, they actually have a slightly different. I should mention that not all editions of the Analects have exactly the same numbers. So if you are looking up something in another translation, you may have to look at, if it's at 1422, the translation in the text you're consulting, the other text you're consulting, it might be at 1423 or 1421 or some other number, because the editions of the Lunyu vary in exactly what they contain, so the numbers differ somewhat. In Bloom and DeBerry, it's 1423. Tzilu asked how to serve a ruler. The master said, you may not deceive him, but you may stand up to him. Stand up to him is a better translation than withstand him. But the Bloom and DeBerry translation, the Legge translation that we have here is more forceful. It indicates that you should admonish him if he's doing something improper. The DeBerry and Bloom translation just indicates that it's permitted. Traditionally, it's generally seen as obligatory and not merely permitted. But in any case, this is a good example of Kongzi straightforwardly indicating the importance of admonishment, but the context is such that we assume that the admonishment will not be confrontational, it will be indirect, it will involve criticizing the present by pointing to the past or alluding to poetry or whatever. And I'll just begin to introduce this last concept, and because we're just about out of time for this lecture, and I'll continue again with this next time. And this next concept I want to introduce is 君子, what's usually translated as the gentleman. There isn't really a good translation of the term, and I'll tend to use the Chinese 君子because gentleman is okay, but it doesn't quite carry the moral force of the I don't feel anyway, of the Chinese. This is the moral ideal, the ideal character. If you have really developed Confucian virtue, 儒学 virtue, then you become a 君子. And specifically, the central virtue of this ideal representative of 儒学 is ren, benevolence, or humanness. It's centrally not doing to others what you would not have them do to you. It's centrally following what in the West is known as the Golden Rule, which has a direct parallel in the Lunyu. So again, this central virtue is ren. And as you may remember, I just a moment ago came upon the character for ren with a different tonal quality, which means human. And the character for ren in a slightly for human in a slightly stylized version is the first part of the character for ren, meaning benevolence or humanness, or humanity or humaneness, which the character for ren merely adds the character for the number 2, as if it's the relation between people or something central to the relation between people. More exactly, ren, it can be sort of decomposed or analyzed into 2 key sub-virtues. These are loyalty and forgiveness. Zhong, and that's, you may remember when we were looking at 1318, I looked at 1319 in the Lunyu and saw Zhong there, and I highlighted it, and we looked at that. Zhong is loyalty. Shu is often translated as forgiveness, although I prefer another translation, which is empathy. So, for example, Zhang, these references that I'm giving here are all listed. The full citation is given in the works cited at the end of this PowerPoint presentation. So Zhang writes that the concept of empathy, or shu, is a further extension of the idea of benevolence, or ren. The term shu means to put oneself in the position of another and to look at the world from that perspective. The character itself combines the grafts from mind, heart, with that for meaning to be like, or alternatively to be like, or alternatively to compare. So if you look at the character here, you see the bottom, those 3 short lines in the going down, and then the sort of bottom of a square that's associated with those 3 lines in the lower half of the character. That's Shin. That's the character for Shin, which means that either heart or mind, and can be translated as either the center of thought or the center of feeling in the human sort of psychophysiology or soma, mind, body. And the top part, where did my cursor go? Ah, there it is. The top part here means to be like or to compare. So shu is to compare hearts, or to be alike in heart or mind. And thus is really very well translated as empathy. So empathy and loyalty are the two primary components of the central virtue of Ren, that is the key to becoming a Junsa. And what we'll do at the beginning of the next lecture, we'll turn to passages discussing Ren, Zheng, and especially Shu. Okay, thank you.